Well, we have reached the beginning of week 4, and you should think of week 4. This course may at times feel like you're climbing Mount Everest. Get it, right? This was that picture of the log jam, too many people trying to get to the summit. But we should feel in week 4 like we've summited and we're beginning this downhill tumble toward the end of this course and your final paper. I know it's looming larger now, but hopefully you're beginning to put pieces together and to have a better sense of what we're doing in the course and how you can craft that final paper. Now, as we begin week 4, I think it's really important to emphasize the idea of systemic sin. We understand systemic sin as institutions, organizations which perpetuate and, in fact, enact sinful ways of being human, often not completely aware that the sin is embedded in those institutional practices and beliefs and norms. And in fact, in terms of theology, we didn't really talk about systemic sin until the latter part of the 1960s and into the 1970s. And the way that it has gradually crept into the church's understanding is an important kind of shift. Now, there are still way too many churches and pastors that focus on individual sin. And individual sin gives us an out. It allows us an escape hatch to say, well, I never owned slaves. No, but you participate in the system where white people have benefited from it, and people of color have been held back in this society and the ability to improve their lot in life. So individualizing sin gives us this escape hatch that I always want to push back against. It's too easy to say, well, someone didn't achieve it because they don't work hard enough, or whatever the individualizing kind of comment may be. And let's be clear that there are systems that exist in society that treat people differently. And the church is, in fact, one of those institutions that has and continues to treat people differently. We have this rhetoric of being fair and treating everybody the same, and everyone being under the power of sin, but we don't act like that. In reality, we do discriminate, and not in the good sense of making good judgments, but in the sense of discriminating based upon this physical embodiment of the human creature. So, systemic sin becomes this very important idea. And when you are dealing with your area of injustice, it can't become your individualized problem. I've been treated this way. It has to take on that systemic character, or we will never get at the kinds of reforms that need to happen. I also want to point out here that it's important to remember that we as a society today have this individualizing perspective. Everything is about the individual, and that is a product of the Enlightenment, and I honestly believe we have reached the pinnacle of this notion of the individual being able to do whatever he or she wants without any real consequence, because we are individuals. We're not. We're interrelated and interconnected, and that's one of the very basic theological premises. Christ brings us into right relationship when we have been broken apart. So we must have this communal kind of sensibility at work if we are being responsible to the way of Christ. And really, the scriptures know very little of this individual kind of perspective. I mean, the people of Israel are always seeing themselves as a collective body, as one people who suffered together the consequences of idolatry. Whether I actually was idolatrous or not, we all suffer this together, meaning therefore we all have a responsibility for each other to maintain the kind of justice and fairness and life together that is demanded of us by God. Okay, so systemic sin is this concept that has to remain in front of us. And you have two readings that are now placed before you this week. One is my fairly recent article about James Cone's theology and how it can be used as a method for liberating whiteness. What you'll want to do there is glean from that article, and I think there'll be some parts that are might be a little difficult for some of you, but the goal here is to ask about ways, things that are spoken of, perspectives that I put forward in that article that the church could draw upon to help it move forward in recognizing and overcoming some of its racist tendencies. Okay, so what are the things that are helpful in that article that I might have pointed out that actually could help us think differently about our ecclesiology, about the church, if nothing else than to begin to shift our perspective. The second article you'll notice by Coley is something of a case study. It's about bridge building work that occurred at Belmont University and conservative Christians and the LGBTQ community. Some of that article, again, won't feel particularly applicable, but the question we're asking is, what are some of the elements, what are some of the learnings from this bridge building work at Belmont that can actually help us to think about the church itself and reform of the church? How can some of these things that are being highlighted in the articles help us to break open some of that systemic sin that exists in the church? You're going to have to do some analysis and some thinking, some extrapolation from these articles, which is a higher level of thinking. It's not that you can read the article and it's going to give you the answer. You're going to have to read the article and then make those kinds of connections. That's what I'm looking for this week. So dig in, let your mind churn on some of the theoretical and practical dimensions present in these articles that might help us think about approaches to the systemic sin that lies within our own churches. And may it not feel like a hike up Mount Everest this week. Okay, you know what I'm going to say. Keep working.